I was 31 years old the first time my mother said my name like it mattered. It was in a lawyer's office in Ohio on a gray Tuesday in March, 3 weeks after we buried my father. And she didn't say it with love. She said it the way you say a word you've just been forced to learn, carefully, like it might still be wrong. Renata. That's my name, Renata Cole. For most of my life, in my own family, I went by a dozen other things before I went by that. The responsible one, the one who doesn't need help, your brother's sister. Somewhere in there, underneath all of it, was a person nobody had bothered to really look at in about 20 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. Not in that office, but at a dinner table, a long time before any of us knew what was coming. Our house, growing up, had a dining table that sat 8, though there were only 4 of us: my mother, Diane, my father, Walter, my brother, Micah, and me. Micah was 2 years older, and from the moment I have a clear memory of anything, I have a clear memory of where I sat, at the far end, near the kitchen door, where you could reach the serving dishes, but nobody could quite reach you. Micah sat beside my father, always. It wasn't a rule anyone stated out loud. It was just how the chairs filled up, dinner after dinner, year after year, until it stopped being an arrangement and became a fact of nature, like gravity. My father was a quiet man who ran a mid-sized furniture manufacturing business he'd inherited from his own father, and he loved my brother with the kind of uncomplicated, unself-conscious pride that some men reserve only for their sons. Micah played baseball. My father went to every game. Micah wanted to take over the business one day, and my father talked about that plan the way other men talk about legacies, like it was already written down somewhere, in ink, official. I liked to read. I was good at math. I wanted, for a while, to be an architect, and I used to draw floor plans of houses I'd never live in on the backs of old grocery receipts at that same dinner table, while the conversation happened somewhere above my head, between my father and my brother, about box scores and franchise dreams. Nobody was cruel to me. That's the part that took me the longest to understand, and maybe the part that will be hardest for you to accept if this sounds familiar to you too. Nobody yelled. Nobody said, "We love your brother more." It was quieter than that, and so much harder to point to. It was the way my mother's face would light up a half-second faster when Micah walked into a room than when I did. It was the way my report cards, straight A's every semester, without exception, got a nod and a good, while Micah's B- in algebra earned a family conversation about how we could support him better. It was the way when I was 14, I asked my father if he'd come to my school's academic award ceremony where I was receiving a medal for the state math competition, and he said he would try and then didn't come because Micah had a scrimmage that conflicted, and scrimmages, practice games that meant nothing, never got missed. I remember sitting in that auditorium with my name called and looking out at a crowd of parents and finding my mother's face, alone, 3 rows from the back, clapping without really seeing me. And I remember thinking very clearly, for the first time, in the specific and devastating language a 14-year-old girl uses, I am not the reason anyone in this family gets excited. You don't recover from a thought like that. You just build a life around it. So I built one. I got good, unnaturally, almost frighteningly good, at not needing anything from anyone. I got a partial scholarship to college that my parents treated as expected rather than remarkable, while 2 years earlier they'd thrown Micah a party when he got into a state school with an academic record that frankly should have embarrassed him. I majored in structural engineering. I graduated with honors nobody in my family asked to see. I got a job at a firm downtown, and within 6 years, I was one of the youngest project leads they'd ever had, managing budgets in the tens of millions. And my mother's response when I told her was, "That's nice, honey. Did I tell you Micah is thinking about starting his own company?" Micah, by then, was 33 years old and had started and quietly folded 3 different businesses, each one financed in part by a loan from our parents that nobody ever called a loan out loud because loans get repaid, and these never were. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy for me to make Micah into a villain, and he wasn't, not really. He was, more than anything, a product. My parents built him the way you build a house on a foundation that was never quite level, with love, but love shaped entirely around the idea that Micah was destined for something, and that destiny doesn't require the same discipline the rest of us live under. He grew up believing, correctly, based on all the evidence available to him, that failure would always be followed by another chance, another check, another soft landing. And I grew up believing also correctly, based on all the evidence available to me, that I had exactly one chance to be worth anything, and I'd better not waste it. We were close as kids. I want you to know that too. He used to walk me to the bus stop when I was small, and he was supposed to be too cool to be seen with me. He defended me once, at 13, against a boy who made fun of my glasses and got a black eye for it, and I remember feeling that day like I had a brother who would go to war for me. I don't know exactly when that stopped being true. I think it happened slowly, like most family fractures do, not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones, each one small enough to swallow, until one day you look up and you're 2 adults who share a childhood and almost nothing else. By the time I was 28, our relationship had become mostly logistical. Holidays, my mother's birthday, the obligatory phone calls. I had a life that I'd built entirely on my own, an apartment I paid for myself, a career I was proud of, a small circle of friends who actually knew me, and my parents had a golden son who kept failing upward, and a daughter they were in some vague and unexamined way proud of, useful, reliable, not something you think about very often. Then my father got sick. If stories like this one, about the quiet cost of being the overlooked child and the justice that eventually finds its way home, speak to you, consider subscribing to Silent Victory Stories. We tell one of these every day, and I'd love to have you with us. It was pancreatic cancer, caught late, the way it almost always is, because my father was a man who treated doctor's visits as optional and complaints as weakness. By the time they found it, the timeline the oncologist gave us was measured in months, not years. I flew home more that year than I had in the previous 5 combined. I sat with him during chemo sessions that made him gray and hollow-cheeked. I brought him the specific ginger tea he liked because it was the only thing that didn't make him nauseous, and I learned, in a strange and backward way, more about my father in those 8 months than I had in the previous 15 years, because sickness strips away the performance of a person and leaves you with whoever's actually underneath. And underneath, my father was quieter than I expected, sadder. There were afternoons when my mother had gone to run errands and it was just the 2 of us in that house, when he'd say things that didn't fit the man I'd grown up with. "You were always the steady one," he told me once in October, when he still had the strength to sit up in his recliner and hold a cup of tea without his hands shaking too badly. "You know that, steady. I used to watch you at that table, drawing your little houses, and I'd think, that one's going to be fine. That one doesn't need me to worry about her." I remember not knowing what to say to that, because it sounded, on its surface, like a compliment, but it landed somewhere much deeper and much worse, like a confession. "I worried about your brother. Every day of his life I worried. And I think—" He stopped, coughed, took a sip of the tea. "I think I mistook worrying for loving, and I think I mistook not worrying with you for you not needing it, and I don't know if that was right." It was the closest thing to an apology my father ever gave me, and I didn't know, at the time, that it was building towards something much larger. I thought it was just a sick man's guilt, the kind that surfaces in everyone eventually, when the end gets close enough that the truth stops feeling dangerous to say. He died in February, on a Tuesday morning, with my mother holding one hand and me holding the other, and Micah, who had told us the night before that he'd be there first thing, arriving 40 minutes after it was over, having overslept. I don't say that to condemn him. Grief does strange things to people, and maybe he couldn't face it and overslept on purpose, without even admitting that to himself. I've made my peace, mostly, with not knowing, but I remember the specific, quiet fury I felt watching my mother comfort him in his grief over missing it, while I stood 3 feet away, having been the one who was actually there and receiving no comfort at all, because I was the steady one, and steady people apparently don't need to be held when their father dies. The funeral was 3 days later. It was well attended. My father had been well liked, a fair employer, a man who'd sponsored Little League teams and given his foreman Christmas bonuses out of his own pocket in bad years. Micah gave the eulogy. It was a good eulogy, genuinely. Funny in the right places, warm, full of memories of fishing trips and Sunday drives that I mostly wasn't in, because those trips had mostly been the two of them. I sat in the front pew between my mother and an empty seat where my father should have been, and I didn't cry, not once, through the whole service, and I remember my aunt leaning over afterward and saying, not unkindly, "You're so strong, Renata. I don't know how you're holding it together." I wanted to tell her that I wasn't holding anything together. I had simply never been given a place to fall apart in this family, and so I'd forgotten, somewhere along the way, that falling apart was even an option available to me. 3 weeks after the funeral, we got the call from my father's lawyer, a man named Arthur Weiss, who'd handled the family's affairs for over 20 years. He asked all 3 of us, my mother, Micah, and me, to come to his office the following Tuesday for the reading of the will. Arthur Weiss's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, all dark wood and diplomas, the kind of office designed to make you feel like whatever happened inside it was serious and final. My mother wore black still, 3 weeks out, and sat very straight in her chair. Micah sat beside her, in a suit that looked slightly too big for him, like he'd lost weight he didn't have to spare. I sat across from them both at a small round table that Arthur had set up, which meant that for the first time in a lawyer's office at least, I wasn't at the end of anything. We were, structurally, equal. That wouldn't last. Arthur opened with the formalities, the standard language, the confirmation of identities, the reading of the date the will was executed, which he noted was 11 years earlier, a detail that meant nothing to me at the time and would mean everything by the end of the hour. Then he began reading the actual dispositions, and here is where I need you to understand something about how this family operated, so that what happened next lands the way it should. The will left the family home to my mother for her lifetime, with the property passing to Micah and me jointly upon her death. That was fine, unremarkable. It left specific personal items, my father's watch, his tools, a set of antique furniture he'd built himself as a young man, to Micah. Also, on its face, unremarkable. Sons often get their father's tools. And then it got to the business. Cole Furniture Manufacturing, the company my father had built from a single workshop into a business employing over 200 people, worth, as I would later learn, not that day in dollar figures that made my stomach drop, somewhere in the neighborhood of $11 million in total assets, was left in its entirety to Micah. To me, the will left $25,000 in recognition of Renata's independence and self-sufficiency, of which I have always been proud. I remember the room going very quiet. I remember my mother's hand finding Micah's and squeezing it, a small involuntary gesture of relief and pride that she probably didn't even realize she was making, and I remember it being the single most clarifying moment of my adult life because it told me, without a single word being spoken, exactly what I had always suspected and spent a lifetime talking myself out of believing, that in the ledger my parents kept, my competence had been used against me. My independence hadn't been admired, it had been counted on. It had let them give everything that mattered to the child who couldn't be trusted to survive without it, and hand the child who could survive on her own a pat on the head and a check that wouldn't cover 4 months of my rent. I didn't say anything. I want you to know that about me. I have spent my whole life being the person who doesn't say anything, who processes things later, alone, in the privacy of my own apartment, rather than in front of an audience. So I sat there in that office with $25,000 and a business worth $11 million sitting on the table between us like a verdict, and I said, okay. And I meant it in the moment more than I've ever meant anything. A flat, exhausted, okay, this is who we are. This is confirmed now. I can stop hoping it isn't. Arthur Weiss cleared his throat. He said, "There's one more item. Your father asked that I read this after the primary dispositions, and only after. It's a letter, addressed to all 3 of you, that he wrote and sealed 11 years ago, with instructions that it not be opened until this exact moment." My mother frowned. A letter? Walter never mentioned a letter. He was specific that it stay sealed, he said. I've honored that. I have no idea what it contains. He opened a drawer, retrieved a cream-colored envelope with my father's handwriting on the front, to Diane, Micah, and Renata, to be opened only at the reading, and broke the seal. If you've made it this far, drop a comment and tell me what you think that letter said. I promise you it is not what you are expecting. Now, back to the story. Arthur unfolded 3 pages of my father's handwriting, small, careful, the handwriting of a man who'd learned penmanship in a stricter era than ours, and began to read aloud. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and the will has already been read the way I structured it, which means Micah has the company, and Renata has very little, and I need you all to sit with that discomfort for exactly as long as it takes me to explain, because it matters." I remember my mother's spine straightening further, if that was even possible. Micah shifted in his seat. 11 years ago, I made a decision that I have regretted in some form nearly every day since, and this letter is my attempt to fix what I don't think I have the courage to fix while I'm still alive to see your faces when I do it. 11 years ago, Micah came to me and told me he'd made a mistake, a serious one involving money that wasn't his, from a business partnership that went bad, and a debt of just over $400,000 that, if it became public, would have meant not just bankruptcy for him, but likely criminal charges. He was 22 years old. He was terrified. And I did what I have always done for that boy, which is fix it, quietly, completely, and without telling another living soul, including your mother, and including you, Renata. I watched my mother's face change in real time, confusion first, then something harder to name, somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror. I paid the debt, I made it disappear, and I told myself I was protecting my son from a mistake that didn't have to define the rest of his life. But here is the part I need you to understand, because it's the part I've spent 11 years failing to say out loud. I didn't just protect him, I started managing him. I started making decisions for that business and for this family based on a story I'd built in my head, that Micah needed to be protected, propped up, given every advantage, because underneath it all, I didn't actually believe he could survive without me. And once I started believing that, I stopped seeing what was happening to my daughter. There was a long pause, Arthur, to his credit, read it exactly as written, without softening a single word. Renata, I called you steady. I called you self-sufficient. I told myself I was proud of you, and I was, but I also used those words as a way to justify giving you less, because you never seemed to need it, and Micah always did. What I understand now, far too late, is that you didn't need less because you had less to give. You had less because you learned, very young, that this family would only give you attention in proportion to how much trouble you caused, and you were too good, too responsible, too dignified to cause any. I punished you for your strength, and I want you to know, before I say anything else, that this was never, not for one single day of your life, a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of my failure to see it. My mother had started crying by this point, silently, the kind of crying that comes from a place too deep for sound. I hadn't moved. I don't think I'd breathed. So here is what I've done, and I did it 11 years ago, quietly, in the same visit where I executed this will, because I needed time, a decade, it turned out, to work up the courage to let it be read. I opened a private trust in Renata's name, funded initially with the exact amount I'd spent covering Micah's debt, $400,000, so that the scales, at minimum, would be even. I have added to that trust every year since, out of my own personal accounts, separate from the business, in amounts I did not disclose to your mother or to Micah, specifically so that this decision could never be undone by pressure, guilt, or a change of heart on my part. As of the date I am writing this letter, the trust is worth just under $2 million. Arthur has the documentation. It is irrevocable. It was never part of the will, because I did not want it to be a subject of dispute, negotiation, or resentment among any of you after I'm gone. It was already hers. It has been hers for 11 years. She simply didn't know. Arthur set the letter down for a moment and reached into a folder, sliding a set of documents across the table toward me. Trust paperwork, bank statements, a decade of quiet, patient, deliberate correction that my father had made and never once mentioned, not even in those long afternoons in his recliner when he was closer to honest with me than he'd ever been. My mother's hands were pressed over her mouth. Micah had gone completely white. Arthur picked the letter back up. I am not asking for forgiveness because I don't think I've earned the right to ask for it. I am only telling the truth, finally, because Renata has spent her whole life being told, in thousand small silences, that she mattered less. I could not undo those silences, but I could make sure that the last thing I ever did as her father was tell the truth loudly enough that no one in this room could pretend not to have heard it. Micah, I love you, and none of this changes that, but I am leaving you the business because I have to believe, that it will finally force you to stand on your own the way I never let you learn to before. There is no more debt for me to quietly erase. There is no me. Whatever you build from here, you will build it, and it will be entirely, finally, yours. I think that is the kindest and most honest thing I have left to give you. And Diane, I loved you for 38 years, and I am sorry I never told you this while I could still watch your face when I did. I hope you can forgive me for that, and I hope, more than anything, that you'll help our daughter understand that this was never her fault to fix. The letter ended there. Arthur folded the pages carefully and set them on the table, and the four of us sat in a silence so total I could hear the traffic on the street below. I wish I could tell you that the room erupted into some cinematic scene, tears, embraces, a family transformed in an instant by the truth finally spoken. That's not what happened, and if you've lived anything like this yourself, you already know why. The truth doesn't undo 11 years or 31 years in a single afternoon. It just makes the years visible for the first time, and visibility is its own kind of wound before it's ever a kind of healing. My mother was the first to speak. She turned to me, and her voice, when it came out, was smaller than I had ever heard it. "Renata, I didn't know." And then, after a pause that felt like an hour, "I should have known. I should have looked." I didn't have an answer for her yet. I still don't know if I fully do. Micah didn't say anything for a long time. When he finally did, it wasn't what I expected. He didn't defend himself or get angry or try to minimize what our father had just confirmed about 11 years of quiet rescue. He put his head in his hands and said very quietly, "I always knew something was off. I never asked. I think I didn't want to know how much it cost to keep saving me. I want to tell you I forgave him in that office, wrapped my arms around my brother, and we walked out of there healed. That's not the truth, and I promised myself starting that letter that I would tell you the truth in this story, the way my father finally told his. What actually happened is that I stood up, thanked Arthur, and left. I drove to a park near my old high school and sat in my car for 2 hours, and I cried, not gently, not the composed, photogenic crying you see in movies, but the kind that comes from somewhere old, somewhere 14 years old, sitting in an auditorium, looking for a father who didn't come. I cried for the medal ceremony. I cried for every report card that got a nod instead of a hug. I cried, strangely, hardest of all, for the version of me who spent 31 years being proud of her own strength, without knowing that strength had been extracted from her, not chosen by her. That steady had been a cage built out of a family's convenience, dressed up as a compliment so no one, including me, would notice it was a cage at all. And then, eventually, I cried with something like relief, because for the first time in my life, I had proof, actual, notarized, 11 years in the making proof that I had not imagined it, that the unevenness I'd felt at that dinner table since I was old enough to notice tables at all had been real, had been seen, even if it took my father until he was dying to say so out loud. If this story is resonating with you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Has there ever been a moment in your life where someone finally said the quiet part out loud and it changed how you understood your whole past? I read every comment, and this community means more to me than you know. I'm not going to pretend the trust fixed everything, because money never does. It just removes one kind of obstacle and leaves you standing in front of all the others clearer than before. What it gave me wasn't wealth exactly, though it was that too. What it gave me was permission. Permission to leave a job I'd stayed in past the point of happiness because I was afraid of instability. Permission to finally start my own small architecture firm, the thing I'd wanted since I was drawing floor plans on grocery receipts at that dinner table, the thing I'd talked myself out of because responsible people don't take risks, and I had spent my whole life being the responsible one by default rather than by choice. My mother and I talk now, more than we used to, though it's careful, still. Two people learning a language neither of us was ever taught. She's asked me, more than once, if I can ever forgive her. I've told her the truth every time. I don't know yet, but I've stopped needing to know before I'll let her try. Micah kept the business. It's been hard for him, harder than it ever was for him before, because for the first time in his adult life, there's no quiet check clearing his mistakes before he even has to feel their weight. He called me 2 months ago, late at night, and told me he'd made a decision I never thought I'd hear from him. He was restructuring his own salary, taking less than the plant managers he'd inherited, until he'd proven to himself, not to our mother, not to the memory of our father, that he could actually run the thing he'd been handed. It's not redemption, not yet, but it's the first honest thing I've seen him do in years, and I told him so, and I meant it. As for me, I still think about that dinner table sometimes, the long one that sat 8 for a family of 4. I think about the girl at the end of it, drawing houses no one asked to see, and I want to reach back through all those years and tell her something I finally believe now, at 31, sitting in an office I built with my own name on the door. You were never the problem to be managed. You were the daughter who was right all along. My father spent 11 years trying to work up the courage to say that out loud. I've decided I'm not going to wait that long to say it to myself. If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely, from the bottom of my heart. Stories like this one only find the people who need them because of viewers like you, who watch, who share, who leave a comment, who hit subscribe. So if this story meant something to you tonight, I'd be so grateful if you'd consider joining this community. We tell a new one every single week, stories about the quiet, unglamorous kind of justice that doesn't come with fireworks, just with the truth, finally spoken. Take care of yourselves. Be gentle with the people carrying more than you can see, and I'll see you in the next story.